The first thing Sergeant Yuki Harada noticed about the alien was that it had no shadow. Everything else on the road had a shadow. The vending machine outside the convenience store, the utility poles, the abandoned bicycle leaning against the fence with its wheels still slowly spinning. Even the crows on the power line cast thin dark lines across the asphalt. But the thing standing at the end of Kurobe Street, in the pale 7 a.m. light, threw nothing onto the ground below it. Just nothing. Like someone had cut the shadow out of the world and forgotten to fill the hole. Yuki filed this away, the same way she filed everything uncomfortable, behind the third rib on the left side, where things went when she didn't have time for them yet. She had a report due by 9. She had a half-eaten onigiri in her coat pocket. She had the particular exhaustion of a woman who had worked the night shift at the Kurobe police station for 6 years and had learned not to bother with first impressions of anything. She kept walking. The thing at the end of the road turned its head 45 degrees, in a direction that was not quite sideways and not quite forward, and looked at her. She stopped. There was a rule in the older parts of Kurobecho that you didn't stop on Kurobe Street before 8 in the morning. Not because of the traffic, there wasn't any, not at this hour, but because of the light. The old women who still lived in the wooden houses said it wrong, said it crooked, like something overheard from a dead grandmother. The morning light on this street he shows you things that aren't meant to be seen yet. Yuki had grown up 2 streets over. She'd heard the rule, she'd never believed it. She believed it now. The creature was approximately 2 meters tall, built in some way she couldn't quite parse. Not thin, not stocky, but proportioned according to a logic that her brain kept sliding off. Its skin, if it was skin, was the color of old limestone, and it was dry, that was what her brain kept returning to. Not the compound eyes which were there, yes, amber and faceted and very still. Not the forearms which hung, in a way that suggested their resting state was different from a human resting state. Not the absence of a nose or the presence of what might have been gills along the neck, or the way its feet, two-toed wide like snowshoes, made no sound whatsoever on the asphalt. The dryness. It was the dryness. Like something that had never been in contact with water and never intended to be. It looked at her. She looked at it. The third rib on the left side was getting crowded. "Good morning," she said in Japanese, because she had been raised politely, and because she couldn't think of anything else. The creature tilted its head in the other direction, the same 45 degrees mirrored. Its mouth opened. What came out was not language. It was closer to radio static given a shape, a pattern inside the noise that her ear kept reaching for and not quite finding. Then it turned and walked through the wall of the abandoned pachinko parlor on the corner. Not through the door. Through the wall. Yuki stood on the empty street for a long moment. A crow on the power line shuffled its feet. The bicycle wheel completed one final slow rotation and stopped. She took out her notebook. She wrote, 7:04 a.m. Kurobe Street. No shadow. Went through wall. She thought for a moment, then added, dry. Then she went to work. The formal first contact happened 11 days later, on the 3rd floor of the Osaka Prefectural Headquarters building. In a conference room that still smelled of the instant ramen someone had microwaved too long on Wednesday. Yuki sat at the far end of the table in her dress uniform, which she'd had to borrow a needle and thread from the front desk to fix the second button, and watched 3 of the creatures arrange themselves in a triangle at the head of the room, with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before in many places that were not Osaka. The United Nations liaison, a Belgian named Dumont with a hearing aid and a slight tremor in his left hand, sat next to her and murmured translations of the things the creatures broadcast through the small silver device on the table that turned their static language into something approximating human speech. They call themselves the Veth, he said. The word translates approximately to the inheritors. Inheritors of what? He looked at her sideways. They haven't specified. The Veth representative, the one in the center, slightly larger, slightly more still, broadcast a pattern. The device translated. We have observed your world for 112 of your years. We have catalogued its biological contents. We have assessed its resources. We have completed our survey. And, Yuki said before Dumont could stop her. The Veth representative's faceted eyes moved to her. She had the sensation of being assessed rather than looked at. The distinction mattered. We will begin harvesting in 30 days. The biological contents of this planet are not compatible with our presence in sufficient density. They will be removed. The process is efficient. There will be minimal suffering for those removed in the early stages. Someone at the other end of the table knocked over a glass of water. Nobody moved to clean it up. The water spread slowly across the wooden surface and dripped over the edge. Yuki looked at the water dripping on the floor. She looked at the Veth. She thought about 30 days, and a bicycle wheel spinning, and something that cast no shadow, and a woman on a street who had said good morning out of reflex, because she'd been raised politely. She wrote in her notebook, "They have completed their survey. They think they know what they found." She underlined the last sentence twice. The evacuation protocols that the governments of the world collectively improvised over the following week were, in Yuki's professional assessment, excellent paperwork. Forms were filled out with great speed and sincerity. Committees were assembled. Press releases were drafted in 17 languages. Emergency sessions were held in buildings with very good acoustics and very comfortable chairs. None of it mattered, because nobody had a weapon that could touch the Veth. This was not lack of trying. On the 14th day, the Americans launched 6 Minuteman III ICBMs at the Veth's primary atmospheric processing station over the Pacific. The missiles arsed perfectly through the upper atmosphere, found their target without difficulty, and detonated in sequence. The station's outer shell rippled the way water ripples when you tap it with a finger. Then it was still again. On the 16th day, the Russians tried something similar. Different result, same outcome. On the 18th day, someone nobody claimed credit, which said something, sent a commando team with experimental kinetic penetrators into the interior of the secondary station that had materialized over central Siberia. The team was not harmed. They were simply redirected, placed gently but completely, outside the station's perimeter, unconscious, without any marks on their bodies and without any of their equipment. The Veth, it appeared, did not find them threatening enough to kill. This was in its own way more frightening than if they had. Yuki had been assigned to the task force by this point. The assignment was largely honorary, a way for the Osaka Regional Police to demonstrate participation, but she'd taken it with the same focused attention she'd given to the first morning on Kurobe Street. She read every report, she made notes. She sat through briefings with generals and physicists and philosophers, and one very tired astronomer from Kyoto, who kept trying to explain something about the Veth's energy signatures, and kept getting cut off by people who hadn't done the reading. She let the astronomer finish. "So their drive system," she said, after the generals had moved on to other arguments, "operates by selectively nullifying inertia." The astronomer looked at her with the expression of someone who had just been handed a glass of cold water in a very long desert. In simplified terms, yes, they don't move through space the way we do. They move through space by deciding not to have mass essentially in the relevant direction. Which is why the wall, she said. Sorry? Why it walked through the wall on Kurobe Street, day 1. The astronomer blinked. "You saw that? I filed a report." She paused. Nobody read it. He rubbed his face. "If they can null field on a local scale, then they can extend that field as a barrier, which would explain why the missiles passed through them. More or less." He looked at her. "You're thinking about something." "I'm thinking about what they can't null field," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "What makes you think there's something they can't?" She thought about the faceted eyes, the way they'd moved to her when she'd spoken out of turn. The assessment. "Because they were surprised, I said good morning," she said. "Something in their survey didn't account for that. Something in their catalog of our biological contents didn't include that particular variable." She closed her notebook. "What they think they found here and what's actually here, those aren't the same thing. And that gap is the only thing we've got." On the 20th day, Yuki went home. Not for long. Just long enough to stand in her mother's kitchen in Kurobe-cho and eat reheated miso soup and look at the altar in the corner, where her grandmother's photograph sat next to a small cup of water and a stick of incense that had burned down to nothing and not been replaced. Her mother, Keiko, was 71 and had the specific posture of a woman who had survived more things than she was going to list for you. Standing at the counter, slicing pickles with the focused calm of someone who understood that the world continues to require meals regardless of circumstances. "You look terrible," her mother said. "Thank you. Eat more." Yuki ate more. She looked at her grandmother's photograph. Her grandmother had died in 1987, but she had spent the last 3 years of her life telling anyone who would listen about the light on Kurobe Street in the mornings, and the things you could see in it, and the way shadows worked differently in certain seasons. Everyone had assumed she was talking about ghosts. Kurobe-cho had a tradition of ghosts. The old kind, the kind that didn't know they were dead, The kind that wandered through walls and stood at the ends of roads and made no sound on the asphalt. Yuki looked at the photograph. She thought about no shadows. "Mama," she said. "Did Obachan ever say what happened if you spoke to them? The things she saw in the morning light?" Her mother set down the knife. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone deciding how much of an old story to tell. She said they always looked surprised, her mother said. She said they didn't expect to be spoken to. Yuki was very still. She thought it was because they didn't believe we could see them, her mother said. She thought they'd been watching us for a long time, and watching us the way you watch things in a museum, from the other side of the glass. And then suddenly someone walked up and tapped on the glass. And they didn't know what to do with that. The incense holder held the gray ash of the burned stick, still keeping its shape. Yuki looked at it for a moment. "Is there more miso soup?" she said. "There's always more miso soup," her mother said, and turned back to the counter. She brought the astronomer with her to the task force briefing on day 22. His name was Takeda Hiroshi, and he had a small telescope on his windowsill at home, pointed permanently at the moon, and a collection of coffee mugs that all said things like "does not suffer fools," and "the universe doesn't care," which is oddly comforting. She liked him. He thought sideways the way she did. What they presented was not a weapon. They were very clear about this. They presented it as a hypothesis. That the Veth's null field technology, which could deflect kinetic projectiles and neutralize most known forms of directed energy, operated on the assumption that it was being directed at something. It required a target signature, a coherent impact profile. It was in essence a system designed to manage things it had already catalogued. Things outside its catalog were, theoretically, outside its management. Like a woman saying good morning, Takeda said. Because they had talked this through on the train from Osaka, and he understood exactly what she meant now. Like a woman saying good morning, she agreed. What is the null field system designed to deflect? Ballistics, energy weapons, mechanical force in excess of, they've calculated, 11 kilograms of pressure per square centimeter. So not sound. Sound is below the threshold, and not radio. Radio is outside their defined threat parameters. And not, she said carefully, the specific pattern of their own communication technology. The room was very quiet. Takeda cleared his throat. Their translation device operates on a narrowband signal in the 2.4 gigahertz range. If you could replicate that signal, if you could broadcast it back at them, at sufficient amplitude, with interference patterns layered. He paused. It would be like walking into a room and hearing your own voice coming from somewhere you didn't expect. At very high volume, through a system you designed to be maximally sensitive. Yuki thought about standing on Kurobi Street, about the way the creature's head had tilted, 45 degrees, mirror image when she'd spoken. They didn't know we could see them, she said. They still don't know what we're capable of. Not really, they catalogued our biology. They didn't catalog our stubbornness. One of the generals at the other end of the table, a thin man from Seoul named Park who had said almost nothing for 22 days, but whose silence had always felt attentive rather than absent, leaned forward. "How long to build it?" he said. Yuki looked at Takeda. "We don't build it," she said. "We already have it. Every country on Earth has broadcast infrastructure in the 2.4 gigahertz range. We're already shouting into the universe. We've been shouting since 1920. We need to coordinate the shout." General Park was quiet for one moment. "You want to turn every radio tower on Earth into a weapon." "I want to turn every radio tower on Earth into something they never considered a weapon," she said. "Which is different, and harder to null field. 23 days, 24, 25. The engineers worked in the cold. This was a requirement of the plan. The systems they were coordinating were distributed across every climate zone on Earth. And most of the work was happening in relay stations and broadcast towers that nobody had serviced properly in years. In places that were cold and wet and remote and inconvenient. Yuki worked alongside them. She was not an engineer. She handed people tools and held cables and brewed coffee in whatever way was available and kept files and made calls. She also walked the perimeter of every installation they visited, in the early mornings, before the engineers were awake, before the light changed. She walked slowly. She paid attention to shadows. She saw 2 more Veth during this period. One at a relay station outside Reykjavik, standing in the parking lot in the gray Atlantic light, utterly still, watching the humans work. One at a mountainside tower in central Japan, crouched on the rock beside the access road, its 4 arms folded in the configuration she'd begun to recognize as something like patience. They didn't do anything to stop the work. They watched it. Their survey, she understood now, was still ongoing. They were still cataloging. They had assessed the humans, determined they were not a threat, determined they could not affect the outcome of the harvest, and filed this determination away. They were watching the way you watch ants before you pour the concrete, she said. Good morning to the one in the parking lot in Reykjavik. It tilted its head the wrong way, both directions at once. She was getting better at reading their body language. That was surprise, she thought. That was the tap on the glass. 29 days, she said, in Japanese, because she'd been raised politely, and because it didn't matter what language she used. Come back in 29 days. It was gone when she turned back to the door, but she'd watched its feet on the wet asphalt this time, and she'd seen something she hadn't been looking for before. The faintest depression in the surface. The barest trace of weight. Not no mass then, just reduced. Managed. She wrote it in her notebook. She wrote it small because it was small, and small was what they had. The window was the last 15 seconds of day 29. The plan required all of it. Every relay station, every broadcast tower, every satellite uplink, every submarine communication array still operational, every airport control tower, every military communication system that could be repurposed. The human world, which had been shouting into space since Marconi first sat down at a transmitter and thought, what if I tried? That human world would, for 15 seconds, direct every decibel of its vast, accumulated, century-long noise directly at the 3 VETH atmospheric processing stations in a coordinated pulse, at their own frequency. Layered with interference patterns, their translation devices would read as coherent signal, as message, while simultaneously overloading the signal-sensitive components of the null field emitters. Not a weapon, an interruption, a tap on the glass. Yuki was in the coordination room at the Osaka headquarters, which they had taken over completely, every screen running, Takeda at the adjacent console, with his reading glasses and his does not suffer fools mug, and his hands very steady on the keyboard. General Park was on the line from Seoul. Operators were on the line from Reykjavik and Nairobi and Sao Paulo and Delhi, and 47 other locations where humans had, in 29 days, quietly and without fanfare, rewired the most ordinary infrastructure imaginable into something the VETH had never thought to catalog. Through the window, the sky above Osaka was the specific orange-gray of a sky that is waiting for something. The primary VETH station was visible, had been visible for a week, as a dark geometric shape above the clouds, motionless, the size of a small city, casting a shadow over everything below it that was not quite a shadow in the normal sense but was enough to make the light feel wrong. 30 seconds, Takeda said. Yuki looked at the photograph she'd taken from her mother's kitchen, her grandmother's photograph, the one from the altar, and propped it against the base of her console. She wasn't superstitious. She was, however, the granddaughter of a woman who had walked Korob Street in the early mornings for 80 years and had known, in her bones, that the things you see in liminal light are the things that matter. 20 seconds. She looked at her notebook. The last entry, faintest depression in the asphalt. Wait, they have mass. They've just been managing it so long they forgot it's there. 10 seconds, she looked at the screen. At the 49 lines representing 49 locations, green lights, all present, all ready. 5. She looked at the geometric shape in the sky above Osaka, dark and very still. 3. She thought about good morning. 2. She thought about her grandmother on a street before sunrise saying something polite to a thing with no shadow. 1. She pressed the key. What happened was not an explosion. The task force had hoped for something more cinematic, she knew. Something visible, something that could be put on the news. What happened instead was a sound. Not a sound that anyone on the ground heard. Exactly. It was in the 24 gigahertz range, which is above human hearing, which was the point, but it was felt. Every person in a 50-kilometer radius of each VETH station felt it. In their back teeth, in their chest cavity, in the specific bone behind the ear that vibrates when something large and very loud is happening nearby. A felt sound, a pressure more than a noise. The dark shape above Osaka flickered. That was the word for it, flickered. The way a light flickers when the connection is uncertain. The way a screen flickers when the signal is interrupted. Then it flickered again. Then the null field, which had for 29 days, extended around each station like a second skin, invisible and absolute and completely impervious to every catalogued threat humanity had thrown at it, collapsed. Not collapsed, exactly, faltered. The way a very large and very confident thing falters when it encounters something it had sincerely not believed existed. They had 3 minutes. Takeda had calculated 3 minutes from the null field fluctuation to the moment the Vethin systems would recalibrate. General Park had prepared for 3 minutes. The kinetic strike packages that had been loaded into position over the previous 2 weeks, orbital platforms, artillery installations, the reconfigured ICBM batteries that had missed so badly on day 14, now armed with something different. Something that was not a conventional warhead but a continuous impact system that exploited the exact pressure threshold Takeda had calculated. Came in on a coordinated vector. They hit the station above Osaka, did not fall, it retreated. This was the distinction that the scientists argued about later, in the papers that would be written in the years that followed. The Veth stations did not simply crash. They retreated, which implied a decision, which implied something inside them that could make decisions, which implied that what Yuki had was correct. They had mass. They had weight. They had been managing it for so long in so many places, with such thorough success, that they had catalogued themselves as immune to consequence. They were not immune to consequence. All 3 stations retreated simultaneously. The dark geometric shape above Osaka rose, shrank, became a point of shadow, and was gone. The sky above the city was suddenly just a sky, orange-gray and waiting, and then the sun broke through the cloud to the east, and the light that fell on the streets below was ordinary, just light, making shadows under the utility poles and the vending machines, and the bicycle leaning against the fence, somewhere in Kurobe-cho, 2 streets from where a sergeant had walked to work one morning and said good morning to something that cast no shadow. In the coordination room, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Takeda said, very quietly, "All 3 stations are in upper atmosphere retreat. They're not firing. They're just leaving," General Park said over the line. "Leaving," Takeda confirmed. Yuki looked at her grandmother's photograph. The woman in the picture was 23 years old, and standing in front of a house that didn't exist anymore, wearing a dress that was probably the only good one she owned, squinting into the sun with the expression of someone who has been asked to hold still for longer than feels natural, and is politely doing her best. Yuki had, for the first time in 29 days, nothing pressing to write in her notebook. She wrote anyway. They left, she paused. Then, "They'll be back." She underlined it twice. The second survey began 14 months later. The Veth were patient. This was, Yuki had concluded, their most dangerous quality. Not their technology, not their numbers, not the scale of their operation, but their patience. A species that had been watching humanity for 112 years before deciding to act. Was a species that understood something about the long game that most of the task force's generals found difficult to think about without wanting a drink. But 14 months was time. It was enough time for Takeda to publish. It was enough time for 3 generations of engineers to build the second system, the improved system, the one that didn't rely on existing broadcast infrastructure, but had its own dedicated network. 40,000 small relays, installed quietly in every accessible location, solar-powered, hardened against electromagnetic pulse, cross-linked so that no single point of failure could break the chain. It was enough time for Yuki to make Sergeant Major. It was enough time for her mother to replace the incense on the altar and to put up a second photograph. Yuki, at the Osaka headquarters, the day after the stations retreated, looking less terrible than usual. It was enough time for schools to add something new to their curricula. Not just physics and history and mathematics. Something older than that and stranger. The habit of attention. The practice of noticing what's in the room that doesn't cast a shadow. Of speaking to things that don't expect to be spoken to. The small domestic insurrection of saying good morning to a world that thought it knew what you were. The Veth returned on a Tuesday. The notice came through Takeda's monitoring array at 3 in the morning. 17 objects entering the upper atmosphere on descent vectors, consistent with the previous year's station deployment. Larger this time, more of them. They had updated their catalog. Yuki was at the coordination room by 3:40. She had her uniform and her notebook, and the photograph from her mother's kitchen, which lived on her desk now, next to "Does Not Suffer Fools," which she'd borrowed from Takeda and never given back. She had the 40,000 relays and the kinetic platforms and 6 additional systems that hadn't existed 14 months ago, designed by engineers who had finally been given a problem they could solve, because someone had, precisely and at the right moment, told them what kind of problem it actually was. What she did not have, what nobody had, what the Veth were apparently counting on, was the element of surprise. Not from her side. They knew the broadcast weapon now. They knew the pressure threshold. They had updated their null field calibration. They had recatalogued. They had, however, made the same mistake they made the first time. They had catalogued the thing they'd seen and assumed they knew everything about it. They had not catalogued what it cost. The humans who had built the relay network had put their own money into it. Personal savings, voluntary contributions, community fundraisers in towns so small their names didn't appear on maps the VETH had ever bothered to acquire. The people running the monitoring stations were volunteers, retired engineers, amateur radio operators, university students in their spare hours. An 80-year-old woman in Kurobe-cho, who had installed one of the small relays on her own roof herself, because her granddaughter had explained what it was for. And she had understood immediately, in the way of someone who has been paying attention for 80 years to the things that matter in liminal light. The VETH had catalogued resources. They had not catalogued will. When the stations began their descent, the relay network came online. All 40,000 nodes, simultaneously, the collective infrastructure of a species that did not stop building when it was scared but instead built harder and more carefully, and with more attention to the details that mattered. A species that had been told, 14 months ago, exactly the shape of the gap between what the VETH expected and what was actually there, and had spent 14 months filling that gap with every tool and every quiet, stubborn hour of labor available. The null fields faltered in the first 11 seconds. 11 seconds, not 3 minutes. Because the system was better now. Because the people who built it had understood what they were building. The kinetic strike packages had 12 minutes this time. 12 minutes was enough to do significantly more than 3 minutes, to 17 stations instead of 3, with an accuracy calibrated not to the original pressure threshold, but to the updated one. Takeda's team had calculated based on the VETH's own recalibration data. Data they had broadcast during their descent. Because they broadcast everything, because they had never imagined that the receivers at the end of those broadcasts were paying attention. 7 of the 17 stations retreated immediately. The other 10 held position longer. A few descended further into the lower atmosphere, where the kinetic packages had less accuracy and the null field fluctuations were less complete. That was when the small weapons came in. Not small as in weak, small as in distributed. Small as if in 47 nations had spent 14 months quietly building something no single government would have funded. A redundant, dispersed, cross-linked system of close-range kinetic platforms that looked, on any individual satellite survey, like agricultural equipment, communications infrastructure, weather monitoring, the ordinary clutter of a civilization going about its ordinary business. The VETH had surveilled it from above and catalogued it as non-threatening. It was the asphalt in the parking lot in Reykjavik. It was the faintest depression under a foot that was supposed to have no weight. The remaining 10 stations retreated at the 40-minute mark. There was no clean moment of victory. There was a morning that arrived without a shadow over it, and then an afternoon, and then another day. Orbital assets reported all 17 objects accelerating out of the system. Takeda, running on no sleep and bad coffee, confirmed this at approximately noon on the day after the second survey began, with the specific restrained elation of a man who had spent 14 months calculating something, and who had turned out, finally, to be right. General Park, who was now a general of a joint command that hadn't existed 14 months ago, coordinating forces from 61 nations, said, over the line, "Do you think they'll come back?" Yuki, who was sitting at her console with her notebook open to a clean page, said, "Yes, when they've finished cataloging why they failed again," she said, "and when they think they've accounted for it." She thought for a moment. "We'll be ready before that. You sound very certain." She looked at the photograph on her desk, her grandmother at 23, squinting into the sun with the patience of someone who is politely holding still for longer than feels natural. "I'm certain because we're stubborn," she said. "It's not a quality. It's not a strategy. It's just what we are. They've been watching us for 112 years. In 112 years, they should have noticed." The third survey didn't come for 6 years. 6 years was time enough for the network to become something no single person had planned. A permanent planetary early warning and response system running on volunteer labor and municipal budgets and the ingenuity of engineers who had finally been handed a problem they were allowed to solve for real. It was staffed around the clock by people who had the specific attentiveness of those who had learned that the things that matter are often the things you walk past every morning without looking at. Yuki was chief coordinator by then. She'd kept the rank of sergeant major, because she liked it, because it was honest, because the word sergeant came from the Latin word for servant, and she thought that was accurate. She served the problem. She had since day one. Takeda was on the team still. He'd gained a global reputation, 3 honorary doctorates, and a third mug that said I was right alongside the other 2. He handed her one of his bad coffees on the morning. The third survey began, without being asked, because they had worked together long enough that he knew when she was going to need it before she did. Larger, she said, looking at the readout. Much larger, he said. 31 objects, lower entry vectors. They've adjusted the null field to operate across the full broadcast spectrum, not just the 2.4 gigahertz band. So our relay network won't work the same way. She drank the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. What have we got? He pulled up the secondary readout. The kinetics still work. The null field adjustment changes the broadcast vulnerability, but it doesn't change the mass physics. They still have weight. They've just decided not to. She thought about that. Then we don't need the broadcast window. We just need the kinetics to hit before they can null field the impact. The problem is speed. Their atmospheric descent is faster this time. We have, he calculated, about 40 seconds of unshielded exposure before they establish full null field coverage. 40 seconds was not 3 minutes. It was not 12 minutes. It was 40 seconds, which was enough time for exactly one thing if that thing was prepared, coordinated, and utterly committed. Yuki looked at the readout. She looked at Takeda. She looked at the photograph of her grandmother, which was the same photograph, which had not aged, which still showed a woman squinting into the sun with the patience of someone holding still for longer than is comfortable. She picked up the coordination headset. All stations, she said. This is Harada. The window is 40 seconds. I need everything we have in the first 40 seconds on a coordinated strike vector. Not staged, not sequenced, all of it, simultaneously, every system, every platform, every asset. She paused. We practiced for this, you know what to do, 61 nations. 40,000 relay nodes. Kinetic platforms in low Earth orbit and in hardened ground installations, and in 18 modified civilian aircraft that were, on any survey, just aircraft. The full weight of a species that had spent 6 years quietly building toward a 40-second window, because someone had said years ago on an empty street, good morning to something that didn't expect to be seen, and had then spent the rest of her life making sure that the next time, and the next time, and the next time after that, humanity would be ready to say something more than that. The stations began their descent. The 40 seconds came. Yuki pressed the key. What the Veth found on their third survey was not what they had catalogued. They had catalogued a world of fragile biological contents. They had assessed its resources. They had calculated its threat profile at negligible. They had updated this calculation twice, after 2 encounters that had not gone as modeled, and both times the update had been more organized, better infrastructure, faster response. They had not catalogued love, not in any category they had, not in any assessment metric they used. They had watched for 112 years, and they had seen buildings and roads and tools and conflict and technology and the slow expansion of a civilization across a planet's surface. They had seen all of this through the glass, from the outside, with the systematic thoroughness of something that catalogues rather than encounters. They had not catalogued the woman who drove 6 hours through snow to install a monitoring relay on a mountain access road because her granddaughter had explained what it was for. They had not catalogued the retired engineer who had worked, unpaid, for 14 months in a relay station in Iceland because he believed in the problem even after his government stopped funding it. They had not catalogued the 2,000 amateur radio operators across 47 countries who had kept their stations warm and their logs updated and their children informed, just in case, just because you never know. They had not catalogued the specific quality of a species that, when told there is no solution, goes home, eats reheated miso soup, looks at a photograph on an altar, and starts working on the solution anyway. The third survey retreated in under 4 minutes, all 31 stations. This time, they did not merely retreat. They accelerated, past their usual orbital holding pattern, past the moon, back out into the dark between stars, faster than their earlier retreats, with a quality to their vector that Takeda, watching the telemetry with the particular excitement of a man who is watching something unexpected happen, described as hasty. They're not planning a 4th survey, he said. Not anytime soon. Look at the velocity. That's not a strategic withdrawal. That's an O. Yuki, who had said good morning to something with no shadow on an empty street on an ordinary morning 6 years ago, and who had spent 6 years making sure that that morning meant something, said, "N.O., N.O.," he confirmed. Like when you find out the thing in the museum could tap on the glass this whole time. He paused. And it turns out it wasn't waiting to be noticed. It was just being polite. She was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother said they always look surprised," she said. "Maybe they'll write it up," Takeda said, "for their next catalog. Add a new category." She picked up her notebook. The current page had 6 years of small entries, each one a detail that had mattered. A weight in asphalt, a frequency range, a pressure threshold, the way 40,000 nodes sound when they all speak at once. The page was almost full. She turned to the next one. She wrote, at the top, in small, neat letters, what they didn't know we were. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her pocket, and went to call her mother. Outside the window, the sky above Osaka was just a sky. The sun made shadows the way it was supposed to. The shadows fell under the utility poles, and the vending machines, and the bicycles, and the crows, and everything else that had weight, everything else that had mass, everything else that was real. It was a good morning. It always had been.